How can we better understand the user's intent? Hi, welcome to the Hello World Show. I'm Spencer Schneidenbach.
I'm Heather Downing.
And today we have Dave Rael, a husband, dad, podcaster, and software guy, most well known for doing the Developer on Fire podcast. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Spencer, Heather. It's great to be here with you guys.
Excellent. What do you have to show us today?
Well, I wanted to get into expressing intent using the language of the domain rather than the language of the UI or the solution space.
Okay, so for somebody who's been doing this 5 minutes, what does that mean?
It means talk to your experts who know something about the system you're trying to create using their language instead of telling them about, commands and functions and all of these kinds of things that we geeks like that aren't going to be that interesting at all to them.
Gotcha.
Right, so don't start reading C# code to a business analyst or somebody on the front line.
Indeed.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
if I declare this variable like this, that's a bad thing.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, you lose people and you kind of lose track of the problem itself, and just it becomes an exercise in futility.
So how do we avoid that?
So I've got an example here of a feature, right? So I'm using some tooling that's often associated with behavior-driven development. I don't necessarily want to talk about behavior-driven development except to mention that often when people think of BDD, they think of tools. And I'm using a tool here called SpecFlow, using the Gherkin language to express the specifications for this system here, and kind of exposing some things that I see really commonly in people that I deal with and some of those things. So you'll see an example here that this is what I call the tech feature. So I'm talking about creating a new loan. Imagine that we are building a system for a library for checking out books and all of those kinds of things, right? So loan is what I've talked to my imaginary domain expert and decided that that's what we want to call these things. So checking out is kind of something that's been imposed on people over time, and it's not really necessarily the way they talk about it. They want to loan media, and so in this case we're talking about a book. So the in this example here, right, often these Gherkin specifications are written with a description at the beginning that says, here's the description of the feature. Here's the thing that I'm trying to accomplish. And so in this case, I see this a lot with user stories in systems like Jira and some of those things. I go into a place, and they're using this Dan North, Chris Matt's kind of a sentence template to express here's what the user story is. So there's the as a in order to do something kind of a thing. And I see this a lot, that as a developer, I want to do something. And I think when we do that, it's a lot of times we're kind of at a loss for trying to figure out who is the actor in this thing that I'm trying to do something for, but it's usually not the developer that's the end user of this thing. I mean, unless you're creating a system that is for developers, right? Some developer tools or something like that. So as a back-end developer is something I see a lot and I don't like it. And then if we get down into the scenario here, here's an example of trying to use the thing. And we're talking about an authenticated user, which is something that I don't think librarians are ever going to be talking about, right? And some things like invoking an add to cart command and some of that kind of stuff. And so we're dealing with things that developers want to talk about rather than things librarians want to talk about. And this last one is kind of the kicker for me. The ultimate is when they talk about that I should see a row in a database table. Well, that's we've really gone outside of the realm of things that are interesting in the domain. So this is the tech spec that I think is less than desirable. So the next one I have here, I call this one the UI, right? So we've gone a little bit further. We're saying, hey, library user, right? That's a little bit more in the realm of thinking about the kind of user that I'm talking about. It's still talking about users, which is a very generic term that doesn't really tell us a whole lot. We're talking about checking out books, which is not necessarily the way the librarians want to talk. It may or may not be okay, right? If we had a real domain expert, we could ask them about that. So, and then we're going to go down further here. I'm talking about now that I've logged into a website, right? And I'm talking about adding a book to my cart, which is really more kind of specific to an implementation of how a website might work than it is to a library. When I press checkout, right, again, I'm talking about user interface elements on the screen, and I'm clicking some of those things, right? And then the result should be that the screen shows me something. Well, that does tell you a little bit about what you want from the system, but it's still falling a little bit short of talking about the domain of borrowing a library book.
Okay.
So here is another example of a feature, and this is kind of the one that I landed on as expressing the intent a lot more clearly. So now the user that I'm talking about is a young reader, right? This is something the library might be really interested in, expressing that they want to get young people excited about reading, right? So now we're speaking their language, right? And my purpose is to enjoy great literature. It's not about any of these kinds of things about checking out a book or any of those kinds of things, right? The end goal is what we're expressing here. And right, I just want to get access. That's the ultimate thing that we're expressing. So if you look at my example of create a loan, given I have a library card, that might be debatable, right? If I'm talking to a librarian, they might not care about a library card or not. We'd have to actually get a librarian in conversation to figure out whether that's really the case. That may or may not be the best way to express that, but my imaginary librarian told me that that's the way they think about it. So that's basically the gist there. And then I've got an example here, right? I've gotten very specific in this example, right? I choose to borrow Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire is an expression of an example of somebody, right? And that's something that a lot of the behavior-driven advocates will tell you is that they're trying to express software specification by examples. So I've gotten very specific here and said, hey, this is the example that I want. And then when I have that executed, right, I've got a lot of test-driven development type advocates will say arrange, act, assert. This is really an expression of that same thing. I'm setting up some preconditions, I'm performing an act, and then asserting the expected result. And that's basically the gist of what I wanted to say about expressing these things, right? Get into the language of the domain. Talk about librarians and the things that they care about, not so much about web user interfaces or databases.
Really try to understand the business.
Indeed.
Right.
Yeah.
Don't convince the user that we need to use C# for this because you've already lost the battle.
They don't care.
They have no.
Yeah, they know about browsers because they know that they need to launch that thing, but to them, it's a little icon on their desktop that they need to click, right? That's the extent.
Or sometimes they don't know about browsers. Maybe they just know that's the button for the internet.
Indeed.
Like an IT
yes.
crowd.
Yeah, you said it better than I did there, Spencer. Yeah, definitely.
So even if you're not the one who's interfacing with the client, you're saying that like the developers in your team, or even if it's just you should describe your objects in the same way that they are being utilized. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's really one of the core tenets of Eric Evans and domain-driven design is
Right.
speak a ubiquitous language and get everybody talking in the same way. Use those things to name your objects. Use those things to talk about the specifications, the requirements, the user stories, however you want to state what those things are. But yes, those are your specifications. That's what the thing's supposed to do.
Nice. Thank you so much for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Absolutely my pleasure. Following along behind Jennifer Marsman and Richard Campbell and John Skeet, it's an honor.
Don't forget to share this video on social media.
And comment below to be entered into our weekly giveaway.
Tell us what questions you have for our guests. See you next time.